The original Resident Evil games are great. They're awesome. And I'm of course talking about the first 3 on the PS1, the ones that came out in the 90s, the last generation before airplanes were scary. While the remakes rule in their own right, they sort of don't hold a candle to the originals. They lack vision somehow in terms of expanding upon the scope of their PS1 counterparts. I'm more so talking about the RE2 and 3 remake if you hadn't guessed, since the RE1 remake is pretty much perfect, arguably superior to the original in every way. And RE4 remake is great, though it goofs on a few narrative elements that were near and dear to my heart. But in terms of Raccoon City, fighting zombies and using the supplies we can fish off the bodies of dead cops and mercenaries, I don't think anything hits the mark quite like the original Resident Evil trilogy manages to. There's a unique kind of simulated sense of survival horror that at times becomes too cinematically focused in the remakes, sometimes to the point of completely losing the script altogether. I'm mostly just disappointed at how little they did with the remakes, in terms of expanding upon the foundation of the originals. There was plenty of space to add cool new environments on top of the existing framework without actually changing or removing stuff, yet that's the route they took. Rather than having more time in Raccoon City, it nearly removes all of it from both games. When it comes to recapturing the essence of RE2 and RE3, the remakes felt more like impressive tech demos than fully realized experiences. I never in my wildest dreams could have ever imagined they'd make the remakes feel smaller than the original PS1 games. And I personally believe it's because they were remaking them for the wrong reasons. Not to improve the games or to actually update them for modern audiences, but to combat modders and independent game designers from doing it themselves, stealing what could have been a possible revenue stream for Capcom. I'm not saying the remakes were phoned in by any stretch, but it does feel like they were trying to pump them out quickly to capitalize on what modders were doing in their spare time. Now, it's probably easy for most people to assume that I'm primarily talking about RE3 Remake. And if you're familiar with the Resident Evil franchise, then to some extent, you're right about that. But I'm talking about Resident Evil 2 Remake as well. Both of these remakes have sort of a fatal flaw in their execution, and it makes me wonder at times what it is that modern developers have against letting players just make their own decisions, letting them experience things on their own terms, at their own pace, or just facing the harsh reality of their choices in general. On some level, the remakes do majorly incorporate the basic survival horror design. You get things like health items, weapons, ammunition for those weapons, and you use them as intelligently as possible to try to make your way through adversity. But where I find the remakes miss the mark is in how they seem to forget that player choice is more than what bullets you use or how many healing items you consume. It's also about which paths you take. While there is some extent of this in the remake, I think it's fair to say that they're both much more streamlined than their PS1 counterparts. Many of the divergent paths in RE2 and RE3 are straight up missing from the remakes, with the later game's entire foundation being essentially scrapped for a linear sequence of forced obstacles and encounters. But I'll start with the RE2 remake to keep things clear. One of the first and most glaring differences between RE2 and its remake is that the entire Raccoon City portion is more or less missing. In the original, you had to trek through the Raccoon City streets as either Leon or Claire to reach the police station. And it's really interesting how difficult and off-putting this section of the game can be to new players, many of which started with RE2 and had just skipped RE1 altogether. It's an absurdly difficult start to the game that requires you to know essentially all the controls and how to carefully maneuver around enemies or you die within the first 10 to 12 seconds. And this may even seem like bad game design, but it's actually genius. The whole point of this ghoulishly difficult Raccoon City section is to illustrate how unsurvivable it is to stay outside on the streets. It's to paint the picture that the chaos of this viral epidemic cannot be brute forced with bullets or muscle. It's a show versus tell situation where instead of suggesting that the streets are uninhabitable, it shows you firsthand the crowds of undead and how dire the entire situation has become. On your first playthroughs, fighting these hordes is next to impossible, and it's quite a trial for first-timers to even get to the police station. And it creates what I think is the best bait and switch in the entire series, something they perhaps wanted to do with RE1 but didn't have the technology yet. The entire premise of it is that there's this false sense of sanctuary once you reach the police station. But that illusion is quickly lifted once you see Marvin bleeding to death on the ground. Once you see the silent licker crawl past the window, you realize that the RPD is a whole other monster, and that you'll find no sanctuary here. In the original Resident Evil, this feels like what they were going for with the mansion. They even have that text crawl. You escaped into the mansion where you thought it was safe, yet. And this suggests to me that, on some level, Capcom enjoyed the theme of luring the player into a false sense of security from the outset of the series. In the RE2 remake, that entire narrative beat is missing. And even though there is a brief outdoor section in the first scenario, it's incredibly short. Like, painfully short. It takes less than 40 seconds to get to the RPD gate, if that. And the zombies themselves mostly don't aggro the player. Even then, they're only a threat if you stop holding down the run button for some reason, which you're unlikely to do. Sometimes I wonder if they did this to retain the threat of the zombies. However, they did add a gas station sequence that was only a cutscene in the original, so it's not like you don't know what you're up against. Unfortunately, the theme of false sanctuary and the narrative implications of the zombie outbreak aren't really the only things lost by this omission in the remake. By removing all the meat from this section and shortening it dramatically, you also lose a lot of the cool gameplay paths that are expanded upon by what players decide to do before reaching the RPD. Firstly, there's Brad, and the ability to fight him if you reach the RPD without collecting any bullets. This is the obvious one, but it's not necessarily the important one. It's the choice to have Kendo's gun shop in this section and not later on in Leon's campaign that really makes the difference. In the original game, you can get Kendo's shotgun early by fighting off the hordes within his shop, or by running up and grabbing it quickly before the zombies notice you, sometimes only taking a small bite in the process. Believe it or not, this is a game changer, and it can drastically affect how you proceed through the rest of the city or even the police station. When you get the card key from Marvin and unlock the east and west wing doors in the main hall, you can choose to go either way instead of being forced down one or the other. But it's typically suggested you want to go through the west hall door first and face the licker right away. This is because the east location is absolutely packed with zombies. You have to come back here anyways, so it heavily pressures the player to come back later and forego any of the resources you may find on this side of the police station. But if you have the shotgun and you go in there early, this gives you access to all the resources and goodies in the East Wing before you even come in contact with the licker. Obviously, in the remake, they drastically alter most of this so that it can be more streamlined, so having the shotgun early wouldn't make much of a difference in this case anyway. These early gameplay decisions heavily affect replayability, and to me, they're what Resident Evil is all about. It may seem insignificant considering it's just one specific change, but this particular omission kills what I felt like set the entire narrative tone of the game. Without that early Raccoon City gauntlet, there's simply no answer as to why Leon or Claire would choose to endure the small hell that is the RPD. As RE1 put it, it's too dangerous to go outside. Why would Leon or Claire choose to spend so much time in a police station if they just breezed through the streets and could find a more secure location or perhaps even an escape route? You don't just hurt replayability with this change, you hurt the entire logic of staying inside the RPD. And half the game takes place there, so in turn, you hurt the logic of the entire game. I also find it fascinating that with the new technology Capcom had with these remakes, that they wouldn't choose to actually expand on the Raccoon City sequence for how much more visually stunning a set piece it could have been. Instead, they shy away from it, maybe due to how technically demanding it is compared to the PS1 static backgrounds, but even in the concept art, there was a lot more shown in the city sections, and it looked like potentially some of it got passed off to the B team when making the RE3 remake. I think in a way, a lot of us were rationalizing this in our head. At first, I remember saying to myself, well, maybe they wanted to maintain the slow tension for as long as possible in the A scenario and are saving the dramatic outdoor stuff for scenario B. And that would have made a lot of sense from a pacing standpoint. It would have given the players the amazing Raccoon City spectacle and simultaneously did away with the brutal skill barrier that made the original RE2's outdoor section so unforgiving. But no. The B scenario has literally no town section at all, even less than the first scenario. Well, it was at this point that I did some more rationalizing. No matter how hurt I was, Maybe they were saving all of this for the RE3 remake, which is a game that's primarily outside. And I thought it was cool that they did actually add some stuff from the original intro into Claire's trek to the orphanage. But at that point it was a tad too little too late, and it was just a bunch of dogs running around that I'm not sure captured the essence of the original or the narrative power of how dangerous the city had become. So for me and many people, RE3 was what we were all waiting for, and oh boy, we're in for a fucking double dose of eat shit from Capcom's B team. It's amazing to me that the RE3 remake managed to have all the same issues as the previous one, only dialed up to 11. And unlike the RE2 remake, it wasn't something that primarily affected the first portion of the game, but the entire game. It's sort of ironic that the original RE3 doubled down on player choice to the point where the game literally had a live selection screen, as though it were a choose-your-own-adventure book. It's ironic because in the same way that the RE2 remake emphasizes linearity over player choice, the RE3 remake doubles down, except this time to make one of the most linear fucking games you'll ever play. The disappointment that I felt when RE3 Remake turned the entire uptown section of the original into a goddamn walking sim. Well, let's just say I didn't touch myself that night like I did after playing the RE2 Remake. It was at this point that I realized that the developers had forgotten that at its core, the original Resident Evil games were a survival sim. It wasn't about aiming or cutscenes or anything like that. It was about item management, carefully choosing what targets you're going to spend resources taking out, and which paths to take to minimize how quickly you drain your total resource pool. Like I said, a very stylish survival sim. And interestingly enough, these types of games have become quite popular, especially with the zombie horror subgenre. Games like DayZ, Project Zomboid, and even Dead Island managed to create a more visceral survival atmosphere than the franchise that literally revolutionized it. Sometimes I wonder why the remakes adhered so closely to the originals in terms of scope, when they could have expanded the game to take place across the entirety of Raccoon City. Specifically RE3 Remake, which, in the original I felt very much did its best to capture the feeling of being trapped alone in a huge town with zombies. The RE3 remake adds so much linearity that it's practically a different genre even. The remakes are still great to play, but overall they're much less interesting to replay because it's mostly just more of the same. The style of progression and player choice is sorely lacking throughout. About the only thing that RE3 remake did well, in my opinion, was how fucking cool it made Nemesis. Some people complain that he lets Jill go too often and has opportunities to kill her and doesn't, but somehow I think this gives him more character. He wants to kill her clean, like fairly, kind of like Predator. And speaking of newly captured inspirations, does Nemesis in the remake remind anyone else of Doomsday from the Death of Superman comic? He's the nemesis of the main hero, wears a containment suit to hide his true monstrous form, and adapts to every situation and comes back stronger and stronger the more you put him down. Just something I noticed and thought was pretty interesting. Unfortunately though, that's where the good ends with the RE3 remake. Nemesis doesn't kill Brad like he does in the original. Jill doesn't explore the city much whatsoever and is mostly herded into interiors after the first hour of the game, and about 45, maybe 50% of the game's original content from locations, bosses, and enemies completely cut. Just to illustrate how much was cut, there's no brainsucker enemies, no crows, no worms, no web spinners, no gravedigger boss, no clock tower location, no backtracking to Uptown, no Raccoon Park, no Nikolai helicopter boss, no kinky shirtless tentacle nemesis, no live selection, and no different endings. It's also worth mentioning that they do replace our kinky tentacle nemesis phase with something much, much less interesting and more generic. I like Carlos's change, I guess, but there's really not enough material there for me to really talk about. And you know what the funniest thing is to me? RE4 Remake had tons of backtracking and exploration, a game that was known for its divergence from the series for being linear and action-oriented. It's hilarious to me how backwards the remakes are in terms of capitalizing on their most powerful elements. The entire script is flipped for no reason whatsoever. The entire village portion of RE4 Remake, before reaching the castle, drags on for ages now if you're a completionist, and yet it's not that interesting of an environment to explore, not from a visual or narrative perspective. Yet Raccoon City, the most interesting and narratively exploitable environment in the franchise, is now a brisk 1-hour cakewalk of completely linear paths that waste all the potential of the most iconic location in all of the zombie horror subgenre. Not to mention wasting the most iconic Resident Evil baddie and potentially the most recognizable villain in all zombie media. I've never felt more disappointed with a game than RE3 Remake. I wanted to feel overwhelmed by the scale of it all. In the original, the game actually starts in the early morning after the police and UBCS try to contain the spread of the infection. And there's this haunting silence that overwhelms you. The only living person you even see after a while is Brad, who's surviving by the skin of his teeth, likely because of his skills as a STARS member. When he's killed by Nemesis, that feeling of isolation is altered into something even worse. You're beset with the knowledge that the only other living thing in this city is a highly intelligent, militarized super mutant with heavy artillery that wants you dead. I don't think RE2 or RE3 Remake knows how to let the player take center stage for too long without shoving some cutscene or dialogue or atmosphere and immersion-wrecking bullshit your way. It can't help itself. Even when you see the liquor scurry up the window in the RPD, Leon can't help himself but to say some cheesy-ass shit like, "What the?"
What in the?
Compare that to the original, where you get the vibe that Leon possibly didn't even see it, as he doesn't react whatsoever. This makes it feel like only the player caught it, only you caught it, and it's scarier that way. It almost sort of pulls you into the experience. Leon maybe didn't see it, but you did, and you have to be the one to prepare for it. When the character reacts to it, it sort of puts something between you and the threat, making you feel less afraid. Even the raw silence of that moment in the original is superior. It reminds me of the air screamer moment in the original Silent Hill, how after grabbing the map or whatever on the counter, you see the thing silently flapping its wings in the window behind you. The silence adds to it. But when you hear the loud snarl of the creature with the audible climbing sound and then Leon saying some shit like, "What the?" it just takes all the air and suspense out of the moment. The scare is gone. It over-sensationalizes something that didn't need to be altered, and this lack of subtlety is something that a lot of games today have an issue with for some reason, specifically games like Silent Hill 2 Remake, for instance. And while I think the Silent Hill 2 Remake is totally serviceable, it doesn't really hold a candle to the original in terms of its atmosphere. That's not to say the Silent Hill 2 Remake doesn't have atmosphere, because it absolutely has an incredible atmosphere. It just doesn't have the right one. It actually felt more like Silent Hill 1 or Silent Hill 3 than it did to me like, Silent Hill 2, which was less about outright visual hellishness and more about the smothering and sexual undertones of a very tortured soul. And if you know anything about that game or how it concludes, you know exactly why those specific tones are important. So yeah, I'll stick with the original for these games today. I mean, at least in terms of survival horror. The original Resident Evil games and Silent Hill 2, for instance, they're not even remotely outdated in any way besides graphics. They hold up tremendously well, and they maintain a minimalistic style that goes a long way with the whole survival sim thing, the thing that they pioneered so long ago. It's hard growing up and watching everything you love get remade. In some ways it's my favorite thing because I hate everything new and I like to relive the franchises that I grew up with, but at the same time it's agonizing to watch new developers miss the entire point of what made things so special in the first place. In closing, the Resident Evil remakes are incredibly good games, especially compared to a lot of the shit pushed out today. I love them. They balance the survival horror genre and the modern over-the-shoulder action genre even better than the original RE4 did. But the problem, in my opinion, is that they're somehow less charming, less imaginative, and more restrained in virtually every way. And sometimes the things that we love about the originals, the things that made them ingenious, is overlooked and left on the cutting room floor. Developers sometimes miss the importance of things when trying to recreate or improve upon the original formula. Remakes are simply at a disadvantage because of this. There's always something lost, and while it's true that there is usually something gained in the process, it puts you in an awkward position where there's stuff you like about the original and stuff you like about the remake. And to get the full experience, you kind of have to play both. I find this to be less the case with the RE1 remake because of how closely it adhered to the original. And I think that's why comparisons like this matter, because it truly feels like remakes can be done better than they are, at least right now. They're becoming a common occurrence in pretty much all media formats, from movies, games, and even music. The only thing that changed in the RE1 remake is a bit of the specific enemy layout and the revision of the retro 80s horror vibe that was changed into something much more realistically disturbing. However, the change was blended so well and is still maintained throughout the remakes, it's often seen as an upgrade to what was a dated and kind of niche grindhouse tone. It can also be said for the RE1 remake that it didn't cut anything, and it only added things to the experience, which was a major gripe people had with the other remakes, myself included. Even the RE4 remake removes things, but the only difference is that RE4's update adds so much to the experience that it can kind of easily be forgiven, and much less is omitted in general. So in my opinion, though the remakes are great and do a fairly excellent job, you're still better off playing the original games, as they're much more expansive, generally more fun, and definitely more replayable. Hell, even the RE4 remake is a slosh to replay because it's like 7 hours longer than the original. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I guess depends on how much free time you're willing, to spend replaying something. But anyways, thanks for watching, and subscribe if you like this kind of content, as I'm going to be focusing more on this and streaming for a little while. Don't ask me about dinosaurs in the comments unless you want me to jump through the screen and smack you. So long, and enjoy hyperreality. Bye.